Hi everyone, I'm Kevin, and this is HFX by Bike, a YouTube channel all about getting around Halifax by bike. In an earlier video, I mocked up some ways of expanding the existing Dunbrack Greenway southward to make trips in the area more convenient and better enable access to the Chain of Lakes Trail for the surrounding community. I covered 3 approaches, all of them connecting the existing greenway as far south as Dunbrack goes, but I think we can do even better. In today's video, I'm going to showcase some possible approaches to extending the greenway northward. The first question to answer is, why does the greenway need to be extended north? The short answer is that there isn't currently a direct path by bike between the neighborhoods north and south of Highway 102. Creating a coherent north-south corridor of bike infrastructure would enable more people to safely navigate the city by bike and connect several parks, recreational trails, and commercial areas to the city's bike network. As an example of the status quo, if someone was at the intersection of Dunbrack and Washmill Lake Drive and wanted to travel to Dunbrack and Walter Havel Drive south of the highway, the most direct route would be to just bike down Dunbrack. This trip would have a distance of about 2 kilometers and would take someone on bike about 6 minutes or so. This trip is something you can technically do legally, but few ever will. Given the speed limits of about 80 kilometers per hour in some stretches, the need to cross a narrow bridge, and the lack of a shoulder in some sections, moving along this stretch of Dunbrack outside of a car is a non-starter for most people. The alternate routes involve a detour to either Bears Lake, which would be about 6 kilometers or 18 minutes, or down to Fairview, which would be 4.7 kilometers or 14 minutes. And that's by bike. Virtually no one is going to be walking through this space. A direct path would cut travel time between these sections of the city by roughly 2/3, which seems worthwhile to me. So the first thing we need to figure out is how to get off the Chain of Lakes Trail and pick a path leading to the 102. I think there's 3 main options. The first, which I'll mark in red, is to run a multi-use path along a utility cut west of Dunbrack. This is pretty intuitive, as the large trees have already been removed and the terrain has been somewhat flattened. It also orients directly with an existing trail north of the 102, so there's not likely a need for any wacky detours. There would still be a lot of work to do. The Chain of Lakes Trail isn't level with the surrounding ground, so there would need to be some kind of a ramp excavated into the ground to make that level. A side benefit of this approach is that you're far enough away from Dunbrack that biking or walking along this path might actually be somewhat pleasant. The second approach would be run a barrier-protected multi-use path along Dunbrack itself, shown in gold. Both sides of Dunbrack are similar enough that I'll just show both. The big selling point for this approach is that just like with the southward expansion, Dunbrack has a continuous paved shoulder that could be used for this purpose without the expense of clearing trees or flattening terrain. A side benefit is that it's basically continuous with the existing greenway, whichever side is used. A big drawback of this approach is that getting people between the Chain of Lakes Trail and any hypothetical multi-use path is going to take some doing. There's a pretty substantial vertical gap between the trail and Dunbrack where they intersect. There's already a gravel path connecting the two on the eastern side, but it's much too steep for most people to use, having about a 14% grade. So a ramp would need to be built to make this one work. In blue, I've marked a path between the Chain of Lakes Trail and Dunbrack that runs through Fairmount. This would be practically free to implement, but would represent a pretty significant detour for users. This path should exist, but it's not a good supplement for a ramp. Okay, so we're off of the Chain of Lakes Trail and we're at Highway 102. Now all we have to do is cross it. There are a few different ways we can do this. The most obvious one is recruiting the existing overpass. The shoulder continues over the overpass, but it's pretty narrow. Once you take into account the physical barrier that would be needed, it would be quite a bit less than 1.5 meters wide, which is too narrow for a bidirectional path. For that reason, I mostly tend to discount adding any kind of multi-use path across the existing overpass road surface. Another option would be to add a lightweight cantilever bridge attached to either side of the existing overpass. This would be analogous to the McDonald Bridge bikeway, save that the pedestrian and bikes would be on the same path. This option has quite a few advantages, the most important being that it maintains a direct path and requires the least amount of infrastructure to build out, i.e. it's cheaper, and requires the least amount of detour to navigate. The biggest drawback is the need to cross the 4 ramps connecting the overpass to the highway on either side, 2 having either a stop or yield sign, and 2 having neither. I think this would work for confident riders and pedestrians, and be a huge improvement over the existing crossing, but it would fall pretty short for most people in making the space widely accessible. Formalized bike and pedestrian crossings could be introduced along the remaining ramps to make them a little bit more accessible, but it's definitely a barrier. An extension of this approach would be to redesign the entire overpass. A better version would be similar to the Larry Utek Boulevard, which also crosses Highway 102, but uses roundabouts to slow and manage interactions with the highway ramps. One ramp that doesn't interact with the roundabout has a marked pedestrian crossing. Of course, the existing overpass will never be replaced just to add a path for pedestrians and cyclists, but at 50 years old, it's probably approaching the end of its lifespan, and it wouldn't be that strange for this kind of design to replace the existing structure. This shares a basic path with the cantilever bridge model, and so I'll just leave them in place on the map marked in orange. Stepping away from the existing overpass, probably the most popular option would be to build a separate, freestanding bridge for bikes and pedestrians. A bridge spanning the entire footprint of the highway isn't intrinsically out of the question. There's a bike and pedestrian bridge over the Highway 102 in Truro, so it can be done. This approach would have by far the best user experience, being the only one to allow people to move through the area without interacting with motor vehicle traffic in any way. It would be a bit of a mega project to create a new freestanding bridge. The highway is mostly level with or positioned slightly above the surrounding terrain, so ramps would need to be constructed on both sides of the highway to allow for similar clearances as the existing overpass. There's also the issue of the positioning of the bridge. It needs to be clear of the existing overpass and ramps, and ideally cross at the narrowest point. East of the overpass, it would represent a roughly 400-meter total detour away from Dunbrack, with the ramp spanning roughly between the top of School Avenue and Fairview and the clearing on the other side of the highway. This would be a roughly 45-meter span, which is not radically different from the bridge in Truro that I showed earlier. West of the overpass is a little more complicated. The recent addition of the bypass lane from the Highway 103 has extended the total footprint on that side of the overpass, meaning that the span would need to be almost 90 meters at the narrowest point, with a nearly 800-meter total detour from Dunbrack to get there. Alternatively, the bridge trying to directly align with the utility cut would have a span of almost 150 meters. For that reason, I tend to be pretty skeptical of a freestanding bridge west of the overpass. Thanks, Highway 103. Crossing the 102 is probably the most complicated part of this whole thing. Once we're past it, Dunbrack reverts to having a pretty generous shoulder on both sides of the road. Once it reaches Main Street, we have quite a bit of space on either side of the road to play with, usually having some combination of the painted bike lane, a grass boulevard, and a sidewalk. Between all three of these, the vast majority of Dunbrack can support a multi-use path with a ton of space to spare. Up to the intersection where Dunbrack becomes Kearney Lake Road, there's not much to discuss besides maybe changes to the intersections to make them more comfortable to bike through. But we have those issues dotted all around the city, so I'll just brush past that for now. A good question is which side of the road the path should run along, and I think there's good arguments for both options. Their neighborhood west of Dunbrack already has the mainland linear trail providing a northwest connection, whereas those east of Dunbrack have Dunbrack. With all the new developments going up in the Rockingham area, I think it's important to give better access points to those neighborhoods. A major caveat is that which side is best is going to be largely determined by how the path crosses the 102 in both the south and the north. For the latter, the west side is going to be much easier to facilitate any kind of bike infrastructure due to the existing sidewalk and more open space on the other side. So whichever side is best overall, it would probably need to land on the west side of Dunbrack or Kearney Lake Road by the time it hits that intersection. So I guess the two paths I would model out for most of the distance would be a path continuing non-stop on the western side and a path moving along the eastern side that crosses at the intersection with Kearney Lake Road. I will say that the space constraints with things like utility poles become a bit more real as we move north from the point where Dunbrack ends and it becomes Kearney Lake Road. I don't think this is a showstopper, it just makes it a little bit more complicated than other parts of the path more to the south. Past the end of Dunbrack, the options would converge on the west side of the street, leading to the end point of the expansion at the 102 overpass. There's an existing sidewalk on one side that could be adapted as a shared path with a bit of widening. This would connect pretty seamlessly to infrastructure on the other side, although that's a bit beyond the scope of anything I would call Dunbrack Greenway. Those are a few of the options that I think could work for connecting these parts of the city with shared pedestrian and bike infrastructure. Paired with any of the other options for expanding southward, the Dunbrack Greenway would extend all the way from Old Samborough Road in the south to Highway 102 in the north, or about 9.5 kilometers in total. Most of that distance seems like it would be pretty straightforward to build, but there are a few points that would represent the largest bike infrastructure projects in the city. Just something to think about. Let me know how you would want to expand the Dunbrack Greenway. As always, thanks for watching, and see you next time.